It's my pleasure to be able to introduce this year's recipient of the Kerr Psychology Division's Mid-Career Mentoring Award, Dr. Jen Coane. Dr. Coane earned her BA and her master's degrees in psychology at Illinois State University and her PhD in experimental psychology at Washington University in St. Louis. In 2008, she began her teaching at Colby College in Maine, where she was promoted to associate professor in 2016. Her primary research interests address memory and language. As a highly accomplished scholar, Dr. Coane is a fellow of the Psychonomic Society, which is a major international organization for cognitive psychologists. Her accomplishments as an undergraduate research mentor exemplify the ideals of the Kerr Psychology Mid-Career Mentoring Award. Those ideals include demonstrating a strong track record of scholarly projects involving undergraduates, providing mentorship to undergraduate researchers who have produced significant work in psychology, securing support for her own work and for her students, as well as spearheading efforts to institutionalize undergraduate research on her campus and across the nation. After reviewing her application, and Dr. Coane has so many accomplishments, but for brevity, I'll provide just a few of the things that Dr. Coane has been doing regarding those ideals. So first, as a research mentor, Dr. Coane has published 19 peer-reviewed journal articles with undergraduate students and 41 presentations with undergraduate co-authors at local, regional, and national conferences. Importantly, some of those publications have emerged from projects that the undergraduate students developed in her classes and not just in her lab. And we're going to learn more about what that looks like from her talk today. Second, with internal support from Colby College and a sizable research award from the James S. McDonald Foundation of about $600,000, Dr. Coane has secured funding for undergraduates to work in her lab and to attend national conferences like the annual meeting of the Psychonomic Society. Additionally, Dr. Coane has consistently earned funding to help support regional undergraduate conferences, specifically one in Maine called Mainly Data. This support has come from both her home institution of Colby College and from the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and Civic Engagement. Beyond this, Dr. Coane has an impressive record of spearheading efforts to institutionalize undergraduate research. Over the years, at the annual Psychonomic Society meetings, Dr. Coane has worked with cognitive psychologists at primarily undergraduate institutions from all across the nation to formalize a group known as ACRU, which is an acronym for Advancing Cognitive Research with Undergraduates, or ACRU. This group organizes a workshop each year at the Psychonomic Society's conference to welcome undergraduates and to foster the next generation of psychology researchers. Dr. Coane's work with ACRU was instrumental in getting undergraduate research membership categories added to the Psychonomic Society's conference in 2023. So as you can see, Dr. Coane's work personifies the mission of Kerr, and her presentation today is fittingly titled Mentorship in the Lab, in the Classroom, and Beyond. So please just join me in congratulating and welcoming our Kerr Psychology 2024 Mid-Career Mentor Award recipient, Dr. Jen Coane.
Okay, sorry, technologically challenged. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you all see my screen? Okay, so thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm somewhat odd. But so I wanted to start by recognizing my mentors. So as Marcus mentioned, I did my undergraduate and master's at Illinois State, working primarily with Dr. Dawn McBride. She was my first research mentor, and I am fortunate now to actually consider her a true friend. We have kids of similar age, and we actually go on vacation together. And she taught me a lot about what I know about mentorship. I also worked closely with Dr. Scott Jordan at Illinois State University. And one of the things I remember about Scott was when I was applying for PhD programs and I had my first interview and I was a nervous wreck, as one is. And the one piece of advice I remember him telling me was, keep it about the work. Just talk about what you've done, talk about the research, and be yourself. And those words have helped me in countless situations. Just focus on the work. At Washington University, I worked primarily with Dr. Dave Belota, who recently retired. And as a PhD mentor, he gave me more freedom to explore my interests and figure out what I wanted to do than I think most other PhD advisors. And for that, I am incredibly grateful because he gave me the foundation to be able to do what I do now. And between Dave and Dawn, I was trained. One of my greatest strengths, I think, as I'll talk about later, is that I am very good at research design and experimental design because I was trained by people who are extremely rigorous in those fields. And finally, Dr. Larry Jacoby, who I want to acknowledge. I worked closely with him, and I did want to acknowledge that he recently passed, which is a big loss to the field of cognitive psychology. He was definitely a giant, and I feel very fortunate that I was able to work with him and get to know him while I was a grad student. So one of the things I always tell my students, and I wanted to share with you, and it's one of the things that I think helps me mentor a diverse body of students, is I like to tell my students how I came to be in academia. It's part of my mission to make things more transparent and clear and celebrate the multiple pathways that we all have to get into academia. So I'll give you the somewhat shorter version than what I often give my students, but I was born near Chicago. I don't remember this because at 2, my parents packed up and moved to Italy. We lived in Milan for several years. I went to Italian public schools there, graduated from high school, went to university. I was a political science major for 1 year. Turns out I really was not into political science. So I went to drama school where I had got a 3-year degree as a dramaturg or playwright. And after that, in yet another transition, I worked for 3+ years as a therapeutic horseback riding instructor. And as much as all of these things largely reflect the fact that, like many undergraduates, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. And this is something that really I try to communicate with students who are often under so much pressure to think like, oh, I have to know what I want. I have to overcommit. I have to do all the things. And granted, this was a few decades ago and things have changed. Um, One of the things I did get from all of these experiences was, even if they're very unrelated and not particularly related to cognitive psychology either, through my time in drama school, I learned how to speak in public. I learned how to present myself. I learned how to occupy space. By working with children and adults with developmental or psychological disabilities, I learned how to recognize diversity and diverse ways of being and learning and existing in the world. Turns out, however, that when you live in Milan and work as a therapeutic riding instructor, you very quickly become broke. So I moved back to Central Illinois, where my mother had moved back a few years earlier. And once I was there, I realized that none of my degrees actually counted for much. So I went to community college because while I was starting college again, I also needed to work full time in order to sustain myself and pay my roommate back in Italy a bunch of back due rent that I owed her. So I worked 2 jobs primarily. I worked at the local newspaper for a couple of years, and then I switched to answering phones at a garbage company. So I got more experience talking to people about really strange things and people I had never known before, and talking on the phone with people. From there, I transferred to Illinois State. As Marcus mentioned, I have my undergraduate and master's degree, went on to my PhD in St. Louis, and then was hired at Colby in 2008. I like to tell people that I made it onto the job market right before the global economy collapsed and there were no jobs anywhere. And at Colby, I am the primary investigator for the Memory and Language Lab. That's my lab. So my research primarily focuses on this very broad umbrella of semantic memory and knowledge. So where I use primarily verbal materials in my research, so lay people think of it as knowledge. Cognitive psychologists, we like to have fancy terms, so we call it semantic memory. Some of my earlier work focused on false memory, so how our pre-existing knowledge influences other tasks that we perform. I've also looked at how we organize this massive amount of knowledge, how we retrieve it, what factors influence retrieval success and failure. I'm also interested in how knowledge is acquired, so how things become part of the knowledge base. And finally, some of my most recent work has been looking at sort of metacognitive aspects of how do people assess the contents of their memory or when they fail to retrieve something. So my lab, like I said, is the Memory and Language Lab. And currently I am on the last year or so of my multiply extended, thank you, COVID, McDonnell Foundation grant, through which I've been able to support myself and hire additional research assistants over the summer and for the academic year. I do have to acknowledge that I am incredibly privileged to work at an institution like Colby that does invest a lot of money in undergraduate research assistants. So our students are paid through work study. Typically, they work about 6 hours a week if it's their own, if they have another campus job. And this makes it possible for me to recruit a very diverse body of students. So I have first gen students, I have students who otherwise might need to work a campus job that pays instead of doing research. So I'm very grateful to my institution for supporting that. And Colby also provides additional funding for full-time research assistants over the summer. So these are 30 to 35-hour week positions for in-depth research experiences for students. So especially your junior students who maybe not be able to acquire an RU position or a research position elsewhere, or a lot of our international students for whom research positions funded by the NIH or the NSF are off limits. We're still able to support them in our labs. So my mentoring philosophy very generally is mentorship is something that is ongoing and active. My mentorship changes across students and within the same student across time. I try to get to know my students, who they are, what they're interested in, what their goals are, and adapt in order to be able to support them where they are and based on their goals. My lab is intended to be a place where everybody is welcome and where students have the option of exploring their own pathways, whether that's going on to graduate school or looking or planning on getting a job or going to med school. I want all students to feel like they have a place in my research lab. And what I think of is research experience as both a means to explore, to build skills, to learn, but also an end just to satisfy curiosity. That's one of the reasons I do research, is because I'm fundamentally curious about how the mind works. And one of the things I emphasize when I'm talking with, especially when students talk to me about working in the lab, I try to emphasize that as a result of doing research in college, what they're going to acquire are two parallel sets of skills. So what? So they're going to learn about what we do in the lab and also how. So how we do research. And so I like to set this up as sort of like skills and knowledge. So some skills that will transfer no matter where the students end up in the future, the skills they acquire doing research, whether it's with me or anybody else, will serve them well no matter where they go. And these are some that most of us probably are quite familiar with. We read and analyze sources, we talk about research design and research ethics. I often have students assist on stimulus development, programming, whatever software we're using. Currently, we use Gorilla and Prolific for a lot of our data collection. In the past, I've used ePrime. We do a lot of data coding, data analysis. My students have assisted with literature reviews, so coding over 900 papers on various dimensions. We often do presentations. I encourage my students to write. As they progress through the lab, they become involved in manuscript preparation. And as was mentioned, I do tend to drag a hefty army of undergrads to conferences, which is much easier when they're in Boston than when they're in San Francisco, uh, being on the East Coast. And I was talking about this with my lab the other day, about sort of what skills they acquired, and they mentioned a few others that I hadn't thought about. They develop skills at contacting participants. We currently do a lot of AIT testing of healthy older adults, and they have to pick up the phone and call people at home, which for a generation that grew up texting can be a bit of a learning curve. Just figuring out how to communicate in a format that is unfamiliar, maybe. They also reminded me that they have to be really organized and manage their time effectively, and that they work in teams a lot. And so these are skills that my own students acknowledged are things they're picking up in the lab. And what I point out to students is that all of these are skills that will transfer, whether they go onto the job or continue in academia or work for a nonprofit. Data analysis, understanding human participants, the ethics of working with other people, reading and synthesizing literature, these are skills that transfer beyond the specific content knowledge that they acquire in my lab. Working in my lab, they also develop a deeper understanding of healthy cognitive aging. So I take a lifespan perspective in my research. So we do a lot of aging work. Obviously, we talk a lot about memory, in particular false memory is one of my core areas of research, as well as metamemory and metacognition. We also talk more broadly about scientific method and the processes of the scientific approach. So I'll often talk to students about the review process. We've read reviews of journal articles that I've submitted, and I introduced them to the concept of reviewer two, which I think is an important thing to know about. We talk a lot about statistics and, the strengths and how to think about statistics outside of oh my gosh, I have to remember how to use an ANOVA. Um, Talk a lot about experimental design. And the other thing I talk a lot about is these somewhat casual conversations of what I refer to as demystifying academia, which is an expression I picked up from my colleague in women and gender studies, Sonia Thomas. And this idea of sort of pulling down the curtains and talking with students about what it means to be an academic, what it means to go up for tenure, what it means to go up for promotion, the difference between a visiting position and a, tenure track position. So all these, and, talking with students about graduate school and applying to graduate school and sort of what our job entails outside of teaching and research. And who do I mentor? Well, primarily research assistants who work in my lab. I usually have between 8 and 12 a year, give or take. I also work with students in courses. So we have a couple of courses that have a research component. These are our second year research methods and statistics, as well as an upper level research seminar. And I have a couple of examples of those later. I also talk a lot with students who are taking other courses or who are not my advisees, but they come and talk to me because they want to talk about grad school or ask for advice on their research project. I have quite a few students who just sort of seek me out for those reasons. I continue to mentor alumni. So one of my former students with whom I'm still collaborating pointed out to me the other day that I really never stopped being her mentor, even if, she graduated in 2016 and has a faculty job now. And I also like to mentor my junior colleagues, one of whom is here on the call with us. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Umanath, who I started collaborating with because she won a mentorship award from the Women in Cognitive Science to work with me. And she is also the one who nominated me for this award. So I really want to give her credit for that. So throughout the talk, I have random pictures of many of my past and current research assistants. How do I go about recruiting RAs? So Colby has had over the past few years a program where they pair a incoming first year student with a faculty mentor to start doing research from the very first week they set foot on campus. And I've been lucky to work with some amazing students through that program, the Presidential Scholars Program. I often recruit students both from our intro psych class, students who stand out or who come up and talk to me after class. It's like, oh my gosh, that lecture was so cool. I'm like, oh, let's talk. You want to work in my lab? If somebody gets that excited about the Stroop task, I want them in my lab. Students often come and just ask. I've had on and off over the years. Colby has a pretty large cohort of students from China, and they're a very tight-knit group. And for a few years, I had this fabulous pipeline of students from China working in my lab because they would talk to each other and come join my lab, which was great. More recently, in response to some feedback from a group of Black students in our major who mentioned that they weren't sure, they didn't always know how to get involved in research. After feedback from these students, I started posting it on our Colby, employment list to make sure that I could reach a broader audience and students maybe who I didn't know, but were interested in research and hadn't met me yet. And that's been really great for finding students who I never would have thought to ask and who have joined my lab and making it a much more diverse and interesting place. And throughout my time at Colby, I've had everything from first year students to seniors. Currently, I have one first year student who applied just from the Colby employment list, and a handful of seniors who are graduating who have been working with me for a while. What my RAs do on a day-to-day basis is a lot of data collection and analysis. So we work collaboratively, so at any point in time, we're usually collecting data on 2 or 3 projects. That's probably why I'm productive, is because I always have multiple irons in the fire and multiple projects at different stages of advancement. They're instrumental in reviewing the literature. I mentioned we have one paper came out a few years ago where we analyzed over 900 papers to see whether they used a particular task. And my RAs did most of that. They do a lot of programming for experimental design. They also generate ideas as they become more familiar with the work of the lab and more advanced. They work on submitting IRBs. And as I said, they often contribute to conference presentations and publications. So here's just a couple of examples of recent papers that students in my lab have collaborated on. They often contribute actively to the writing. So in both of these papers, my students, Talia, Stacy, Tamar, and Kai, worked on the methods and results sections and gave feedback on other parts of the paper as well. One of the things this is probably where I had to go through the greatest learning curve as a junior scholar was, how do I make this all work? How do I organize my lab? About 8 years after being at Colby, I finally convinced the powers that be that I needed a lab email account. I think at that time I had about 10 RAs and 9 computers in my lab. So you can do the math of how many unique combinations of computer and login that involved, and how hard it was to track down files and data. And every time somebody forgot to log out, oh dear, do we erase their work or whatever? So finally, after 8 years, I convinced IT that yes, I actually need a unique login for my lab, and they gave it to me. Which means that we can rely on a shared cloud storage to organize all of the lab materials. So I have a folder that has many, many subfolders where we store everything that students need to know and find. It's all there. They can access it readily. we've tried to move more and more away from paper forms just because paper gets lost. So even when we do have paper forms, we back everything up online. And we have very particular formatting for organizing all of the research. Every individual research project has its own subfolder with particular folders for the IRB data analyses, etc. And I have documents which explain very explicitly to students how we name files, because I guess one of the challenges in working with undergraduates is that they tend to graduate and leave. Um, and they leave, and then you open a file and it's data, final, 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 final. And I'm like, I don't know what this is. So we have a system and the system works. I also have written up documents that I update every year, what the expectations are, how to log into the computers, how to post times on Sona, how to contact older adults, etc. How to enter data. One of the challenges I've had in the past, students would collect data and then they'd leave the lab before entering it into the computer, and then we'd have this backlog of paper that nobody knew whether it had been entered or not. So there was a lot of trial and error in the early days, and probably the last most useful thing is setting up a shared calendar. So I have a Google Calendar where I have a separate sub-calendar for each one of my testing rooms. I have 4 testing rooms in the lab, and a schedule where a calendar where my research assistants post their times. So all the other RAs can see who's in the lab when, which makes it really useful, especially when we're testing older adults. If somebody can't come in because they're not feeling well, they can quickly go to the calendar, figure out, oh, somebody else is in the lab, send them a text or an email and say, hey, can you cover my participant for me? And it also really helps when I hire new RAs. I can encourage them, oh, look, why don't you sign up? If you can schedule your lab hours when somebody else is in the lab, you can shadow them, and my students serve as mentors to each other as well. So early on in the process, I often have students who join the lab. They just sort of jump onto an ongoing project. So I've been doing data collection on this for a while. They get trained, they jump in sort of as an entryway into data collection. As they progress through the lab, the students who are interested, I encourage them to pursue an independent study or talk with them about projects that we're doing, what would they like to follow up on. And this is where I think one of my greatest strengths for being literally the only cognitive psychologist on this campus is I have sufficient breadth of expertise that I can support students who are interested in a lot of things that fall under the umbrella of cognitive psychology. So, and because of my training in research methods and experimental design, even if it's a project I'm not 100%, an area I'm not 100% familiar with, I can support students. And a lot of times they'll do a lot of the background reading, they'll develop the content knowledge, and then my role is to help them work out the experimental design features. So I don't have to become an expert on everything. So early on, I'll often pair them with more senior members so that they sort of have this dyad or triad where they train each other. As they go through, they can take on more ownership. I often supervise students doing their honors theses, and as they approach their senior year, we talk a lot about grad school, career advice. One of the things I always tell my students who are interested in grad school is to make sure they go someplace that A, has a very strong quantitative program, because statistical skills will serve them no matter where they end up. And if they're not 100% sure that they want to go into academia, to find a program that will not discount them for being interested in working in industry. But a program that will support them to become who they want to be, no matter what that pathway is. And after they leave, I often follow up with them. We get papers out. Sometimes it takes 4 to 7 years from when they've graduated. I keep writing letters of recommendation, keep offering advice when it's sought out. And I'm still in touch with a good number of my former students. My lab also, I think it's very important that we create a community. So I have my students take on roles of mentors to each other. They learn with and from each other. We have weekly lab meetings. That's probably one of the hardest things to do as a lab manager is finding a time that 10 undergraduates can be in the same room at the same time. They have very, very busy schedules. We'll read articles sometimes early in the academic year semester. We often read one or two of my papers just to make sure that everybody has the same background of like, oh, this is what we're actually doing. We do a lot of planning for conferences or data collection and just general check-ins, how everybody's doing. And this is also one of the spaces where I do a lot of my sort of informal mentoring and advising. So for example, the other day we were talking about cognitive science and independent majors, which is a pathway at Colby that many students didn't know about. And I always try to have an end of semester gathering in which I feed my students because food is important. It got to the point to where I sort of ran out of room in my house to host all my students. So now we just do it in the lab because my lab got bigger than my dining room table, basically. Um, Honors theses, which I think are fairly common at a lot of institutions. At Colby, it's a year-long project and it's by invitation. So individual faculty invite students to work with them on an honors thesis. These are students who have demonstrated an aptitude and interest in research and who have an interest that would mesh well with the faculty member. So this is Chelsea Stillman. She was one of my first honors students. She went on to get a PhD at Georgetown. And a few years after she graduated, we were able to publish her honors thesis. She had continued some data collection at Georgetown with Dr. Howard, her PhD advisor, who was incredibly supportive and gave her the opportunity to continue her thesis work in her lab. And Melissa was another student, and this was one of the students who she said we agreed she'd do an honors thesis. We usually invite students in the spring of their junior year. We met in September. I asked her what she was interested in, and she said sound symbolism. To which I said, I'm sorry, what's that? Because I had literally never heard of it. And it's the idea that some things sound big, like O sounds like a big sound and E sounds small. And this is one of the examples where she went off and learned all the stuff about sound symbolism, and I just figured out how do we design an experiment to test what you're interested in. And this was work that we were able to get published in the journal Creepy, or Cognitive Research Principles and Implications, which everybody calls Creepy. So these are two very different projects. So survival processing and sound symbolism that are neither in my primary area of research, but I was able to find pathways where I could provide the support and the knowledge and the students could pursue their passions. As was mentioned earlier, we do a lot of course-based research projects. So Colby has two types of collaborative research courses. We have the second year lab of our research methods and statistics, and we have upper level collaborative research seminars. And I'll talk a little bit more about these because they're a really interesting model for how Colby supports student research and how all of our students, even if they don't work in a lab because they don't have time or because our labs are all full, they still graduate having done 2 independent research studies in a collaborative form. So our 200 level course, typically we model it as students are given a target article that is selected by the faculty member. So this is an article that is pretty accessible and that lends itself to an experimental design. During the course, students are learning all about the ANOVA. So we do ANOVA-based research, so a 2x2 or a 2x3. And in spring of 2015, One of the target articles I selected was by Laura Mikas. It was on memory for microblogs, so memory for social media posts. And my students designed a replication, found really interesting data. They looked at item and source memory, and we followed it up in the lab with older adults based on some theoretically interesting questions about how older adults process source information as well as social media. And in 2020, we finally got it published. So a full 5 years after the students had collected the data. Like I said, it takes me a while, but eventually we get things done. And the lead author, actually all three of the student authors, Kim is finishing a PhD in social psychology, Sarah's in a clinical program, and Grace was in an IO program. So all three of these students went on to PhD programs. At the 300 level, I teach a seminar in memory. So this is a seminar course that has an added research component, and all of these are team-based research projects. And every semester when I teach the course, I usually pick a broad theme. So either the overlap between episodic and semantic memory, I've done false memory, phenomenology of memory. This year's theme is all about Endel Tulving, one of the most preeminent memory researchers who passed away last fall. And from this course, I've had a number of publications with students. So this was the very first time I taught the course. My students were interested in idioms. So Claudia is currently a faculty at UC Davis, actually in the Spanish department because she was a linguist. Chelsea was working in academia and has since moved to an alt-ac position. And Jen Corvo is faculty member at Bowdoin College now. So these were students I did this work with. A couple of years later, my students were interested in brand name and products. So Kaylee was very interested in going into marketing and advertising. And so we did a study on priming for brand names. And then the last two papers came out of the semester I taught in spring of 2020. So we were happily, merrily about to start data collection when the world shut down. And somehow or other, we still managed to collect some really great data, which we were able to publish two papers from with these groups of students. So if you look at the titles, these are very different, and none of them necessarily within my primary area of expertise. I learned a lot more about intelligence than I thought I ever would working on these projects, and learned that intelligence is not an area of research I really want to keep doing. But the lay conceptions of intelligence are really fascinating. Intelligence as a construct, not my cup of tea. After students graduate, like I said, I still have close contacts with many of them. I still collaborate with a number of my students. So student who graduated in 2016 and another one, two students who graduated in 2016 were still collaborating on a project. I regularly am in touch with students about mentorship. They ask me all sorts of questions. I nominate my students for awards. I write fellowship recommendations for them. I will still come across some interesting paper and send it to them saying, hey, I remember you were interested in this. I thought you'd like to know this. As we all know, recommendation letters rarely end just because students graduate. They keep going on and doing great things. And I just wanted to wrap up with some concluding thoughts, which is, as we all know, undergrads are amazing, and working with undergrads is so incredibly rewarding. And no matter where they end up, when I first started, I remember feeling sort of like disappointed that my students didn't all want to get PhDs in cognitive psychology. I'm like, how could you not want this? It's the coolest thing ever. And now I realize that part of my role is to help them figure out what they want to do and to take with them what they have learned and have that become part of who they are and take it out into the world with them. And obviously, I would not have earned tenure and possibly promotion to full without my students. They have enabled me to do so much of this work. I know I talk with faculty in other disciplines like chemistry, for example, where often having students work in their lab is valuable and important, but it's not as essential. We need students to collect data. So I really need students to actually be in the lab because I can't be in the lab all the time testing participants. Although I think I'd rather do that than go to a lot of committee meetings. But turns out I'm not allowed to. And finally, I'd like to thank you to you all. Thank you to the Council on Undergraduate Research for everything you do to promote and celebrate undergraduate research and for giving me an award, which is pretty awesome. I want to thank again Dr. Umanath and my former students who took the time to write letters of support and nominate me for this award. To my department and my college who support undergraduate research, and my department chair who, whenever I say, I'm like, can I please hire one more RA, often will scrounge up the money to let me do that because I can't say no to my RAs. To all of my colleagues from whom I continue to learn how to be a better mentor and a better colleague. And once again, thank you to all my students, and thank you to you all for joining me and for listening.